You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine. My children have returned to me here in this Necropolis episode. So you guys had that Piece of Thrash episode that Shelly, Joseph April, and Tyler did together without me. So I felt a little saddened by that. That's why I did the classical music episode by myself and just info spammed about classical music for 2 hours. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed some of the music I shared. I know Shelly got a flag copyright violation on his channel, so that will not be monetized. But anyway, today we had decided we will be doing a metal alignment chart. And with that, Shelly, I brought up the idea to Shelly, and I stated that why don't we do an alignment chart? And Shelly was kind of brewing around, and throughout the years, writing about armchair rhetoric on extreme metal, and he decided there's only 4 kinds of real metal. There's heavy metal, there's thrash metal, there's death metal, and there's black metal. And that's why we have these axes in front of you right now. So, Shelly, do you want to kind of give some logic behind why you decided on having these specific axes, the heavy, thrash, death, and black?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about for a little while now. In that metal is famous for having an excess of subgenres and styles, and some of them are obviously everyone knows they're a bit silly, like pirate metal and things like that. But it, yeah, it's kind of people create these crazy like family trees and like timelines for metal. Like famously, Sam Dunn did that documentary on it as well. And I was like, hang on, how much of this can just be mapped onto these 4 genres, heavy, death, black, and thrash, that actually have in their archetypical form very, very clear features that you can point to within the music that define them. And then you can kind of add these other things that are like sort of modules almost to change the focus of where they are. And then when you mentioned doing an alignment chart, I was like, well, that would be a great time to like test this hypothesis of mine and see how much mileage there is in it. So yeah, that's what I want to do.
All right. So that makes great sense. I really do agree with you that there are 4 different kinds of metal, and all other kinds of metal that fall within these quadrants that we have here. Tyler, what are your kind of thoughts on doing a metal alignment? Do you think this might shed some more insight into what really makes metal metal?
I think it has the potential to shed a great amount of insight into that because, as Shelley said, I think that a lot of the times what people call a subgenre is really an aesthetic variation rather than a substantial difference in approach to songwriting. So I think that you can look at this as not only an analysis of what makes different kinds of heavy metal what they are, but even really to some extent peripherally how music works. What really makes one kind of music different from another. Because if you're looking at something that a lot of people consider as a legitimate genre, like power metal, and then really analyzing the structure, you find that it's really only different from traditional heavy metal in the realms of technique, in my opinion, but we can get more into that later. But I think that's just a small example of how you can see the differences in these kinds of music by placing them on a chart like this.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there that some of the subgenres are certainly quote unquote variants of already established things with maybe a little twist on it, just to slightly change the expression a little bit. So we had kind of talked a little bit about the first few of these. We decided that doom metal should be moved closer to the heavy metal axis there. More so than thrash, because obviously Doom, there's not really any thrash elements in it. If there are, it's pretty sparse because Doom's really slowed down, and like we were talking about earlier, there could be some different variants of Doom. Like there's the Death Doom of Incantation versus the Funeral Doom, which is hardly even music. If you look at the musical content of Funeral Doom, it's so slow, hardly anything going on. It's about creating that ominous atmosphere. But musically speaking, doom metal really goes all the way back to Black Sabbath with the slow dirges that they did, and it's more aligned to traditional heavy metal than anything else on this alignment chart. So, any differing opinions on that?
Yeah, when people say they like doom metal as their thing, like it doesn't really mean anything to me because doom is like exactly what I mean when I say like a module you can place onto other forms of heavy metal. Like for instance, stoner doom is because most of it's very derivative of Black Sabbath is essentially just a rerun of a certain form of heavy metal. Same with Death Doom, although you could argue bands like Winter and Disembowelment kind of took it that one step further, but it is for a band like Incantation just a different way to kind of draw out their thematic material in a very different direction to a Suffocation, say. And then, yeah, there have been, I think there have been some thrash bands that might have had doomy moments, but not a band that you could sort of say is doom thrash. And then, yeah, on the black metal side, arguably early Funeral Doom is kind of what that was, and then yeah, people would want to sort of argue about later bands like the Ruins of Beverast and things like that, but their sort of quality may be in question at times. And yeah, absolutely, like later Funeral Doom is much more like emphasis on the heavy metal side, and yeah, obviously you've got bands like Candlemass that kind of really developed that. So yeah, I think it belongs where it is on the axis.
All right, Tyler, do you concur with earlier? You know where it's at?
Yeah, I concur with where it's at. Yeah, I will say, as I said when we were discussing it before, that when I think of stoner doom, I just think that it's bad. But it's largely Black Sabbath with more hard rock injected in, which is awful. Um, but yeah, I think that doom metal, like Shelley said, is largely just a module that you place onto pretty much any other genre of heavy metal. I think the only addition I would make is that the closest I think that doom metal gets to being a legitimate expression of its own is really kind of the traditional heavy metal and death metal variants, because they actually work the technique of doom of creating sort of shuddering, echoing, uh, dirge-like chords into the thematic material rather than just simply as this is the same music but slower. And but even then, when you're listening to that kind of stuff, um, it's you have to question how much is it really something different from whatever genre it's modifying, because even death doom oftentimes straddles the lines between full-on death metal and doom metal. Incantation, for instance, has plenty of moments that are furious and fast and blasting, as well as the dirge parts.
Yeah, when Shelley brought up disembowelment, I was like, well, they're more foot in death metal than the heavy metal doom that they're kind of going for. I mean, there are really slow passages, but it seemed like Shelley was saying about incantation is more about stretching out the themes. All right, so we all agree that doom metal is really freaking close to heavy metal more than anything else here. So, Shelly, I'm going to let you drive. I'm looking at a tiny screen right now. I'm barely able to see what's here. So I think the next one up is a new wave of British heavy metal. Yeah, that is firmly next to heavy metal for me. I'm not personally a big fan of a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal, but yeah, I concur that it should go right where it's at, next to heavy metal. How about you, Shelley?
Well, yeah, obviously it's kind of it is what heavy metal is. It's like the origin story of it. Like people like to say year one for or year zero for heavy metal was Black Sabbath releasing their debut album. But for me, although that album had moments that obviously were very formative for the creation of heavy metal, it wasn't suddenly that there was an explosion of bands at that time. It was a very slow, informal, disconnected kind of evolution throughout the 70s. And yeah, there were elements obviously of the big three like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple as well. But it wasn't really until bands like Motorhead and Judas Priest and Rainbow started to get going that you had the foundation for what was becoming heavy metal. And then by the time NWOBHM really did evolve by the late 70s, early 80s, that is kind of where heavy metal begins for me in the timeline. It's much, much newer than we kind of tend to think. And yeah, new wave of British heavy metal isn't really a genre, it's more a description of a moment in time and place. But it does pretty much define what most people think of when they think of heavy metal.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I would say that when most people think of your classic traditional heavy metal band, like a quintessential, like, heavy metal band, the sound they're thinking of is going to be the new wave of British heavy metal sound.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, not a very controversial choice there. So next up is power metal, and I'm gonna sort of place this. Obviously, it's very close, maybe further up. It's on the heavy metal axis because it is basically a updated version of heavy metal, but I'm putting it much closer to thrash because it is basically heavy metal in a post-thrash environment where it does start to incorporate more thrashy elements. You'll hear some thrash riffs in a lot of like classic power metal albums, and then later on you'll start hearing elements from extreme metal as well. Um, but yeah, I'm still placing it firmly on the heavy metal axis, and then just a little bit closer to thrash. So yeah, any thoughts?
So, would you consider power metal to be Apollian, like Apollo?
In what sense?
That it's very organized. There's logic to how the riffs are put together. I mean, granted, there's that in black metal, but it just seems like there's overarching logic that's there in power metal, like there is in death metal. Granted, they are different types of expression, but on a higher plane of realization, like if you're looking at the sheer archetypes, the Platonic archetypes of power metal and death metal, there's a overlying structure there. There's a logic and reason for how the songs are kind of put together. So you wouldn't move it anywhere close to death metal at all?
Uh,
Aesthetically speaking, it is, closer to heavy and thrash, but when you take like the metadata and how that's formed into a coherent structure, it may align more with death metal than black metal.
don't know if I agree to some extent with that. Especially because I was listening to Blind Guardian a lot last week for our previous episode. But when you take more modern power metal, I mean, I guess you could say the same thing about death metal, but it was very, very vulnerable to being made into a novelty with bands like Dragon Force and things like that, where it just tends to follow a pop kind of structure with very euphoric choruses. Um, but yeah, I guess power metal in its classic form, as you said, in its like platonic form, is a bit more complex than that, and there is that underlying logic to it. But I wouldn't say that is unique to death metal. I would say the same could be said of heavy metal and to some extent thrash. And again, in its best, most sophisticated form, there is a kind of organization to it that kind of aligns with death metal. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Tyler?
I would call power metal Chlorisian black metal after Chloris, the Greek goddess of flowers, because it sounds very flowery. I think that's why the uh, derogatory term flower metal is very fitting for the genre. All right, that was partly a joke, but no, it does have some. I honestly am surprised often by how similar the melodicism of power metal is to church hymns. Um, and I guess that just goes into the music having a lot of emphasis on sounding inspiring a lot of the time, with their whole epic take on traditional heavy metal. Um, but yeah, I think that ultimately, while it has that level of organization, even more so sometimes than traditional heavy metal, depending on what you're looking at, power metal really falls into the verse chorus approach to songwriting with a really big emphasis on uh, very, as you said, like catchy. Um, like inspiring, so to speak, courses. And I think that out of any genre of heavy metal or subgenre, it really sometimes comes the closest to pop music. I'm not even necessarily saying that as a negative thing, but it's really surprising
Well,
to me that.
they're not. they're unafraid of major scales in power metal. They're willing to actually play major scales, which is technically, happy music. That's pleasant to the ear. It's not threatening at all. Whereas you look at heavy metal, thrash metal, death metal, black metal, that's all threatening fucking music. And power metal is not that threatening. It's more of like empowering, like a religious experience that a lot of people have. And of course, there's the machismo, the macho side of it. But there's like a religious stint to it. Like they want to be glorified on stage. They want to die in battle. You look at Manowar and all that. Um, and it's kind of like a religious ritual for some of those bands. But yeah, I agree
I
where it's
mean,
at.
I would say, although yeah, major scales literally are they do sound happy, but if you place one in the right context or even a chord or whatever, it can lift whatever you're doing into something that sounds threatening and dark. I think the difference is with power metal, they really emphasize the majorness of the keys that they use into sounding. They want it to sound happy. They're not just placing major keys in there to kind of contrast with something else. I think that's the key difference for me. Um, but again, not inherently doesn't mean it's inherently inferior. But it just means that it's yeah, it appeals to me less because of that. But yeah, I think it's in the right places in terms of the alignment chart. Um, so moving on, we have slam. Um,
Oh,
All
toying
right. I don't think we've
I'm toying
actually
with the
talked
idea of
about
putting it in.
slam.
No, I'm toying with the idea of putting it in the rubbish bin. But obviously, it out of these four, it is most closely aligned to death metal, but maybe some elements of thrash.
Uh,
Um,
it's all about the percussion in slam. It's all about the breakdown. It loses a lot of the metalness. If you look at metal as in having like intra musical content, like in the riffs and all that, slam is more about the percussion, more than the riffs, I would say, and it really kind of caters to a demographic of people who wouldn't really be into metal if it wasn't that percussive. Where they wear the basketball jerseys and backwards hats, and it's what I call brocore. And there's a big scene here in Texas. It's called TXDM. It's essentially all these different slam bands, and they all go out and do a whole bunch of drugs and get drunk, and they play their percussive music. And a lot of people like to say it's really low IQ music because it is kind of Neanderthal low hanging fruit. It's like, yeah, it's just play, chromatic chords really fast and boom, 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 there's your riff. And there's not really like much forethought into uh, making something that's musical more than just a percussive experience. And you look at that, you look at other forms of music that these types of people listen to, like rap, and rap is very percussive. It's all about the beat, and if there is musical content, it's like a supplemental attribute rather than the principal source of expression, which is it kind of aligns with some other things I've been thinking about. But I would say slam is verges on not even being metal at all, because of the emphasis on percussion and rhythm. It's so much more than the riffs and melody, which are pretty much non-existent. If you compare it with the four genres that death metal is all about, musical content, having riffs that make sense and a great logic to it, how the riffs are arranged. Slam is more about a percussive and rhythm experience more than anything else. So I think it should go in the rubbish bin, Shelley. I think the essence of it isn't metal. They do use metal instrumentation and metal techniques, but so does metalcore, and I don't think metalcore is metal.
I'm with Jason on this one because, and I think it should go in the rubbish bin, and not just because I dislike slam, but because to me it is more closely aligned to hardcore than it is to metal. It adopts some aesthetic elements of metal, but they have like some chromatic turns of phrase that are meant to sound to some degree dark. Subject matter perhaps is somewhat inspired by death metal, especially the brutal variants with the focus on gore and violence. But really, musically, I think it's much more closely aligned to hardcore than it is to metal. Like if you were to force me to put it on this chart, I would put it towards the death metal quadrant. But really, I would say that it's to use hip terminology, metal adjacent more so than it is metal itself.
Yeah, it's annoying that slam bands get booked on metal festival lineups just because the textural qualities are the same. But yeah, you are correct that the reason slam doesn't appeal to fans like us is because they're not talking in the language that of the music that we love. They are lifting the the material from it, the textural qualities and so on, but they are playing something very different in a lot of ways. And it is kind of an answer. I mean, you alluded to the hip hop thing, Jason. It is kind of an ancestor of new metal in that sense. So I will put it in the bin because yeah, it's too adjacent to metal for my liking at the moment. So yeah. Moving on, we have Viking metal. Now this is a very good example of the idea that I'm trying to kind of get across here. In that, although like Viking metal has its origins in like Bathory, arguably later Graveland, obviously Enslaved, none of those bands play something that is distinct from black metal or classic heavy metal. To my mind, they, the whole defining thing of Viking metal is obviously the lyrics. It might have some Nordic folk elements to it as well. The closest I could say that it is a sort of recognizable concrete musical quality is going for something vaguely cinematic and soundtracky with your sound, which obviously means you are playing quite melodically, you're working in very epic themes, you're working in quite long song structures. But I've seen bands that kind of toy with Viking themes that play death metal, like I don't know how to pronounce them, Sarpa Nitum, the guy from Mithras. He plays in a kind of technical death metal band, but they're very Viking-y themed, or I think it's actually Middle Ages. But yeah, that would be an example where there's a death metal band that kind of works in a similar kind of territory. And then sort of modern Viking, I don't want to say modern, it's probably a good decade, 20 years old now, but like modern kind of carnival Viking metal is kind of a cooked up version of maybe thrash and heavy metal elements with, you know, a couple of folk instruments and some silly lyrics. Um, there can be very good Viking metal, but yeah, I don't think it's sort of a thing in itself. It's an aesthetic that you place over something more concrete. So I'm kind of going to place it towards the heavy and black, but still quite close to the center because it can borrow a lot from death and thrash as well. So yeah, what are your
Well,
thoughts?
I'm thinking about Amon or Mars, and they started out kind of like a hybrid of death and black metal because they did have like the surface level black metal type of tremolo riffing here and there. But it was more in a very melodic sense, as you were saying. And I can see how that can be considered a little black metally. However, overall, I would say they are really closely aligned with power metal, a more anthemic type of power metal expression than anything else. Uh, you look at death metal; they do have the some surface aesthetics of death metal with the Cookie Monster vocals and all that. But when it comes to the music itself, I think it's more aligned to power metal, and power metal, like some folk elements, as you said, than anything else. And it's more about, I would say, also equally, there's a hard rock influence in there too.
Bands
Um,
Like
yeah,
Fintroll, are kind of yeah,
yeah, Fintroll
right.
I wouldn't even consider really metal. But yeah, I'm unsure if this should even be in the metal alignment because it's such an arbitrary type of classification of some sporadic bands that have Viking themes and folk themes. But musically speaking, I think it's really a mainstream type of presentable music that's accessible to the majority, um, rather
Well,
than
just to
having.
sorry to jump on, but just to demonstrate that silliness, like Unleashed get classed as Viking metal because they do have Viking themes in the lyrics, but they are basically a straightforward death metal band. There's nothing that unites them with a Tirasas or a Fintroll or whatever in terms of music. It's just the lyrics, but they get lumped into the same category for that.
I don't think it's a genre or a subgenre. I don't think it's really a subgenre. I think it's just bands that just happen to have some themes of Viking stuff and folk music and whatnot. I don't think it's a real thing. I think it's more of a label that people put to some things that might have uh, a Viking theme here and there, rather than a honest type of musical expression. So I would put it in a rubbish bin. I'm not saying that the bands that are classified as Viking metal are rubbish, but rather that it's not really a thing. Like you said, Unleashed, that's a death metal band, Amon or Marth. You look at their earlier material, they're more like a hybrid of Death and Black, a really accessible form of that. And you look at Fintroll, and Fintroll is just major key, scales, happy folk melodies, and it's not really Viking at all. So I think not saying that the bands themselves are not metal, but the classification is not really a thing. How about you, Tyler?
Yeah, I feel that most Viking metal is, to me, more egregious than power metal, even because it's almost entirely defined by aesthetic attributes, just by subject matter. And a lot of the times, a lot of the social aspects surrounding the scene, like how the band dresses and how their stage show and things like that. And a lot of Viking metal, it kind of falls into similar um, like approach that I think that a lot of melodic death metal does, where I would say it's practically power metal with harsh vocals. And so really all that differentiates it is subject matter. And for someone focusing on music, while lyrics and vocals are obviously a part of music, they're present in the recording. Um, Especially in a very instrumentally focused genre of music like heavy metal, those elements are largely secondary. And so if that's all that's distinguishing you, then I feel like it's very difficult to say that you are an independent genre. It's always been strange to me to call something Viking metal.
Okay, Viking metal, get in the bin. As Jason said, it's not necessarily all bands that we call Viking metal. It's just not a descriptively useful term. So, Gent, I'm just putting that straight in the bin.
Yes.
It's
You don't
not
like
really.
Pooh Rippery? You don't like Pooh Rippery?
It's not even a genre. It's a sound to describe a certain technique on the guitar. You could argue that, like, I think some people argue that that bit in Metallica's one is like an early example of gent, but it's like, well, no, they're just playing the guitar in a certain way, and then Meshuggah decided to make their career out of that. And you hear it all over bands that are classed as like slam or metalcore as well. A lot of what is very unhelpfully called modern metal incorporates it as well, but it's not a genre, it's a guitar technique.
Yeah, it doesn't
Surely.
really. It doesn't fall anywhere in this alignment either. It doesn't. So it's not heavy metal because heavy metal is focused on riffs, whereas gin is more about the percussion and the chugging and having off kilter time signatures, rather than musical melodies and riffs. So I agree. Rubbish bin for gents. I do have to say that Jerry from Scale It Back said that gent was the last metal subgenre that's been created, but I think he's mistaken. I don't think it's a real metal genre. Like you said, it's a technique. Whereas in death metal, there's so many different techniques in death metal, heavy metal, thrash, and black, where I think he did a really good job in having the axes as they are here. But gent is just a technique. How about you, Tyler?
Yeah, I agree. Honestly, gent to me sounds suspiciously closer to hardcore and even butt rock than it does sound to heavy metal. And it's entirely defined by just technique. The people like to talk up gent bands for being technically proficient because of the uh, polyrhythms and off-kilter time signatures. But if your music is primarily rhythmic, that's about all you've got. And that's a pretty limited palette. So yeah,
That's where kind of death metal started going in that direction with about the rhythmic focus being the primary focus. like in the late 2000s and 2010s. That's where death metal started drifting towards, was more of like the rhythmic side. So in that aspect, it started drifting away from the death metalness. So it looks like we all agree that Gent has gone into the rubbish bin. So what's up next, Shelley?
Up next, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on this because you recently penned an article saying that we've all been fooled. Industrial metal is not real because metal and industrial have entirely different ontologies. So just my
Do you
remarks
agree with that?
are,
Do you agree with that?
um, yeah, I mean, you approached it from a different angle to what I would, and it was interesting to read your take on it. But industrial, again, for me, much like something like maybe doom metal, or even maybe not necessarily Viking metal, but it is something that can be bolted on to other forms of metal. So Godflesh, as you mentioned quite rightly in the article, are the closest that has come to articulating what pure industrial metal could sound like, but they haven't released a good album in 3 decades. And then you do have other metal bands that have toyed with industrial elements. I mean, there's elements of it in even a band like Black Funeral, um, and Zyklon B, who have kind of tried to make a thing out of industrial black metal. Obviously, Thorns as well, but they are kind of black metal bands that use futurist aesthetics and a lot of kind of they lift things from like electronica as well, but it's very much still in a black metal setting. Um, so yeah, and then obviously industrial metal proper bands like Ministry and things like that. I don't really class them as metal bands. They're more like hard rock bands that borrow thrash riffs. They use obviously programmed drums and
The
the
terminology I used
repetition. And
was hard rock disco music. Would you agree with
yeah,
that?
I mean that's probably a fair assessment. And then obviously bands like Fear Factory are kind of just well gent basically. So yeah, I think I could get on board with maybe putting industrial metal in the bin. What are your thoughts?
Well, you look at metal and the axes that we have here: heavy, thrash, death, and black. All these share intra musical activities. That's the primary source of expression is musical, and the primary source of industrial music. Not even industrial metal. I'm talking about industrial music, like Boyd Rice having sirens play behind him, looped, and just yelling "Total War, Total War, Total War." That's not musical. I'm sorry. That's technically not musical content. The sound, and with that, it really denotes that industrial music does not have a musical ontology. And what other little musical attributes that are in there aren't really the primary source of expression. It's more of it doesn't necessitate our uh, attention musically speaking. So with that, I would say industrial music is not a musical genre, and metal is a musical genre, and as we've already stated, therefore industrial metal is an oxymoron, and it should be in the rubbish bin.
Tyler, do you concur?
I concur. The only comment I would have had was already apparently made by Jason in his article, which is the closest that you get to an actual industrial expression of metal is Godflesh, especially on Street Cleaner, where the idea of creating a musical expression that sort of evokes the experience of an industrial dystopia is actually present in the musical content of that album. But as far as I'm concerned, they were about the only ones who ever did anything like that. The entire rest of industrial metal is really an aesthetic variant. And oftentimes it's largely defined by incorporating very non-metal aspects of music like hard rock or disco music, as Jason humorously put it. So yeah, I would say that it belongs in the rubbish bin.
Okay, I will put it in the rubbish bin, but I'll give a quick shout out to Skin Chamber, Sonic Violence, and Head of David for other bands of a similar era that almost touched the greatness of Godflesh, but not quite. And Head of David had Justin Broderick on the drums anyway, so maybe that doesn't count.
Did you say
Um,
pitch shifter?
Not Pitch Shifter, no. I kind of think they're too derivative of Godflesh to
All right.
sort of count in a lot of ways, but
What's up
um,
next?
Grindcore. So this should be fairly straightforward. I'm placing it firmly towards death metal, maybe with a little bit of thrash in there because of the shared lineage in hardcore punk. Um, I actually don't have too much else to say on that. I don't think grindcore in the strictest sense is metal, because it doesn't have the narrative, or rather, it's like miniaturized metal in sort of micro form. You do have more metallic, like grindcore bands such as Blood, and then you have punkier grindcore bands in, obviously Napalm Death, and then bands that did take it in a more sophisticated direction, like Brutal Truth and so on. Um, but for the most part, very, very closely aligned with death metal with some punk elements. Pretty straightforward call for me.
I mostly agree. I would say it's a little bit closer to thrash. Not thrash, as a whole. I don't get the feeling that there's thrash and grindcore is closer to death metal, but the way a lot of the songs are constructed kind of reminds me like how thrash songs are constructed. Granted, some songs are 4 seconds long, like "You Suffer," but I would say it's a little bit closer than thrash in that regard. Not greatly closer, but a little bit closer. How about you, Tyler? I think we're running a little long on, so we should start blitzing these subgenres a little bit faster. So
For sure. Yeah, I largely agree. I think if you're going to define grindcore in itself as something different from metal, it's largely a faster version of later hardcore punk, the stuff that would mostly influence thrash metal as well. And the stuff, the kind of grindcore that I would call that I prefer is definitely closer to death metal, in that it has that more influence in like the kind of riff logic approach. So yeah, if I was going to put it on the chart, it would roughly be around where Shelley put it, like towards death metal with a little bit drifting down towards thrash because of the shared lineage that Shelley spoke of.
all right, all right. What's next, Shelley?
Hardcore. So early hardcore is obviously pivotal to the evolution of metal, but it is not. It's firmly in the sort of punk category. It's not a genre of metal. Um, and later hardcore, yeah, it's similar to slam for me in that it gets aligned with metal because of the obvious aesthetic and textural similarities, but it goes for a completely different thing at the end of the day. It's very urgent, very kind of energetic and sort of politically conscious music, whereas metal is much more cerebral and a little bit more abstract. So for me, I don't think it belongs on the alignment chart.
I agree.
Cool, Tyler.
Yeah, I agree too. I mean, there's clearly a lot of hardcore influence in metal, even in death metal, with technique, but as far as like how it approaches music in a very different way.
Well, I do have something kind to say about hardcore. All the hairy like hairy armpit ladies out there that listen to hardcore, they tend to be really cool people. So
That's
Oh,
the Yeah, okay.
Jason
That's very
said something
nice.
nice about.
next subgenre.
He had to caveat it, but yeah, he said something nice about women. Metalcore. Uh, uh, what even is metalcore? Just define it for me. Like, I'm not being stupid. I know what metalcore is, but how
DRI.
is it defined? Just metal with hardcore elements.
I
DRI.
would say metalcore is like if you took thrash metal and you hit it upside the head really hard, and it kind of stumbled and lost its identity, and maybe ate a lot of Taco Bell and had vicious diarrhea. That diarrhea would possibly be metalcore. That band like Five Finger Death Punch. When I was in the Air
Yeah.
Force, a guy came up to me, uh, Staff Sergeant Mata. If you're listening, Staff Sergeant Mata, which I doubt you are, he's like, I like metal too. I listen to Five Finger Death Punch, and I'm like, what? What is this? So when I checked it out, I'm like, dude, Staff Sergeant Mata, this is not metal. It takes like the surface aesthetics of metal, and it's primarily vocal driven. Granted, a lot of things are vocal driven in music nowadays, but what the aesthetic that they're going for is not really like you look at the harshness of heavy metal, thrash, death, and black. This is music that's challenging. You don't get any of that in metalcore, and as we've already stated about hardcore, it's it's like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, not necessarily like completely dedicated to what makes metal metal. So I would say it's rubbish bin, and I've only heard Five Finger Death Punch, so that's the only band I know that is metalcore. But what I've heard from them, I wouldn't classify them as metal. I would say they have some metal aesthetic. They kind of take some thrash riffs here and there, but they present it in such a Care Bear type of way that it's not metal to me at all. I'm sorry, Staff Sergeant Mata, if you're listening to this, but thank you for your service. Tyler, what are your thoughts?
Metalcore is an unholy amalgamation of hardcore, very loosely lifted aesthetics from traditional heavy metal and dual guitar harmonies, and perhaps thrash metal and some of the rhythmic chugging and butt rock. It is not metal. It was a detriment to the heavy metal ethos. Throw it in the trash bin and leave it there forever.
Chili, any more comments on metalcore? I don't know enough about it, but what I've heard, it didn't seem like metal to me.
Well, no, for me, it's bands like Trivium and Bullet for My Valentine, things like that, where, yeah, it's basically a it sort of evolved from the earnestness of new metal and emo, and it said,
Oh,
can we take
what
that?
is the band Him? Have you heard of the band Him? Are they metalcore?
Nah.
No, they're more like pop goth metal.
Uh,
They're,
oh, we'll get
I
to them when
think,
we talk about goth. All right,
yeah.
all right. So
So
Rubbish Bin.
deathcore, again, I was sort of following on from my trailer of thought there, just the post new metal, post emo world took the emotional earnestness of that and kind of tried to blend it with more obviously metallic riffing, and I think that's where you get the kind of quote unquote core lineage from. And deathcore is obviously an attempt to work in a more obviously death metal direction, and with hardcore elements as well. But I kind of consider slam to be just the logical conclusion of deathcore in a lot of ways, in that they're stripping back the sophistication and the logic until you just get one thing, which is those breakdowns and the slam or whatever. And it's a little bit like modern dubstep in a lot of ways, that stripped back all of the sophistication from electronica music and just said, no, it's all about the drop. And then it
I
just becomes very one-dimensional music. So I don't think I'm going to be too far out there and saying deathcore is going to go in the bin as well, right?
I always kind of got the impression like deathcore is if like Corn got rabies. That's
Yeah,
kind of feeling
yeah.
like Jonathan Taylor Thomas, whatever his name is, John Thomas. What I forget his name, but if he got
Jonathan Davis.
rabies, Jonathan Davis, yes. If he got rabies, and the whole band did, and played a little bit faster, and made some screeches and all that, yeah, that would be deathcore. And it's relying on percussion. That's the thing too. If it relies too much on rhythm and percussion and not melody, riff, etc., like actual musical content, we're speaking in like Western terms here, in terms of theory, it's not metal to me. So yeah, rubbish bin. How about you, Tyler?
Deathcore is arguably worse than metalcore. It almost did more to draw what we would loosely think of as extreme metal towards pop music, and to me, it's entirely different. It's a different world. To call it a subgenre of metal to me is a ridiculous miscategorization. So yeah, throw it in the rubbish bin.
Cool. New metal, by contrast, is also very hard to place on this chart because the only thing that it kind of has in common with the genres of metal is the fact that they use heavy distorted guitars. It's basically groovy pop music, obviously with hip hop, very heavy hip hop influence as well. I'm going to shit all over it, but it is, I was of that generation. I was getting into music when Linkin Park were huge, and that was my thing for a while, and it was my way into heavier music. But when you're 11 or 12, you don't know any different. So I'm not
I did.
embarrassed
I
to
did.
openly admit that.
Well,
I
good
know
for
I
you
knew
you,
did,
better when I was.
Jason,
Jason.
because
The rest of us had
good for you, Jason.
I never jumped on
fucking
the new metal train, even though a lot of my classmates did. I'm like, this isn't fucking metal. This is. I used a bad word that starts with W, but um,
Well done, Jason. You get a gold star, but not all of us had your mentors.
new metal is angry butt rock,
So,
not metal.
well,
so that's going into the
my first real exposure to new metal was also while I was in the Air Force. There was a lady who liked Linkin Park, and I she gave me a ride one time, and she played that, and she was singing along to it, and I was like, "What the hell is this shit?" And it's like, "This isn't." They're like, back then, if it wasn't like extreme metal, it got on my fucking nerves. And Linkin Park was just like, ah, it hurt me. Metaphysically, it hurt me. And
Would you say that you were one step closer
the
to the edge?
I
is
don't
that a
think
Linkin
so
Park
that.
reference?
Come on.
Yes, it is.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not in that. So uh, I started listening. I mean, I curiously listened to some new metal later in life, like my early 30s. I'm like, oh, this is what everyone was chatting about. And I also listened to, like, there was this girl in middle school who really liked the Prodigy. It's like, oh, it's really extreme music. So I listened to Prodigy too. I'm like, oh yeah, that's electronic music. And yeah, it's a nothing burger. This new metal stuff. It's white people trying to act black and focusing on percussive elements rather than musical content, and trying to make it quirky in their own ways. And Linkin Park, they're definitely catering to the feminine side of musical expression. And
No.
okay,
Oh God. Okay. Right. We had to pay a heavy price for you to compliment hardcore women earlier, and this is the payoff now. Um, we have to sit through this. So we've covered new metal. Next up, I've never actually pronounced this out loud. Kawaii? Kawaii?
I th- I think it's like pronounced like Hawaii, like Kawaii.
Hawaii.
Kawaii. Kawaii, right,
Yeah.
okay. So
So this is
Japanese metal.
the baby metal people, which I would also say like cyber metal. You've heard that. It's like gent, but a lot of like industrial sounds, and it's not really metal. Kawaii, I tried to listen to a baby metal song, and it's not metal. It's all theatrics. You have, and what it does is it caters to the really lonely men who have bad taste in music. Um, Having Japanese girls up there singing and jumping around and being all happy, uh, uh, and lonely men wanting them to be their waifus or whatever. That's what kawaii is. It's not metal. It's rubbish bin.
Well, yeah, it strikes me as quite just an updated version of like Steel Panther or joke bands, really. I don't really sort of want to dignify it. Um, so we'll just move that
I
down.
hate baby metal. Baby metal is awful because it gets used to gaslight people by if you criticize it, then immediately the response is, "Oh, you must not be secure in your masculinity because you can't just enjoy like a good, fun-sounding, catchy song like baby metal." And it's like, I'm allowed to think it's bad, and it is. It's bad music. I don't have to listen to it to prove a point to you.
Well, that's the thing. I'll freely admit that I like a lot of pop music. I listen to a lot of pop music, like perennially, and I have absolutely, I'm quite like open about that fact, and I will happily boogie along to it. But the problem with baby metal is it becomes adjacent to something that I do take very seriously. And yeah, you're right. The gaslighting does take place where it is just you have to be in on the joke, and it's kind of like, well, a the joke isn't funny, the music's bad, and there's no other reason to kind of engage with it other than just using it as a hammer to beat people with. So yeah, a little bit like the existence of Ghost. I just say, well, it's not aimed at me. It's for kids, or as Jason said, lonely dudes. Um, so next up, we got progressive. Now, this is a useful descriptive term. I will freely acknowledge that progressive, if it's used in the right kind of context to describe a precise kind of form of very technical and information dense form of music that's kind of like the lineage from progressive rock. But I would say it is a little bit like, well, less so than Doom, because progressive is more like a prefix that you put onto any genre. So I would almost say it goes right in the middle because you can have well, it doesn't really work there, but you can have progressive thrash, death, maybe not quite so much black metal, although you do start to get quote unquote progressive black metal bands in the later 90s and early 2000s. Although this chart doesn't really allow for us commenting on the quality of that, because you know later enslaved fucking sucks, but
It's bad.
it's still a kind of usefully descriptive term in some ways. Although with enslaved, it's really not about being progressive in the sense that a band like Atheist are progressive. It's more just they lift elements from Yes and Camel and place it in kind of very average, boring black metal. They're not writing progressive music in the strictest sense of the word, to my mind. So maybe I'll just move it a little bit further over this way, because you definitely have progressive death metal. You certainly have progressive heavy metal, and you do have progressive thrash as well with bands like Voivod and Watchtower and things like that. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
I think it's more of a descriptive term. But yeah, if you're happy with progressive being there, we'll keep it there. How about you, Tyler?
I'm happy with progressive there. I mean, what does progressive mean? Like a narrative song structure? There's tons of metal bands that aren't
I
qualified
was
as
thinking
progressive
about
at all that have that.
I was thinking about Emperor
Like,
too because, with Beethoven's Third Symphony, that was considered really progressive because the recapitulation doesn't happen until like 12 minutes in it, where he introduces the main theme that he starts it out with. And Emperor did the same thing on Night Side Eclipse on Into the Infinity of Thoughts, where that is a very forward-thinking, progressive type of element that was present there. Like 5 minutes into the song, boom, there's the first riff again, and it just grants the piece so much more power. It's like, oh, we've already gone through this
exactly.
journey, and uh, I use
So
progressive more as a descriptor than a genre. But I
Yeah,
understand
there's
the
exactly.
lowercase p progressive, where it is as you describe, like bands um, using very imaginative songwriting. Even a band like Bathory that progressed from album to album to more sophisticated forms, but no one would call them progressive metal. And then there's uppercase P progressive, which is kind of what I was referring to with someone like Enslaved, and you could maybe say the same argument about Death, where they're very explicitly borrowing from a form of music that has its ancestry in 70s progressive rock, which is a style that kind of leans into jazz and odd like chord shapes and time signatures and stuff, which is kind of what most people think of when they think of progressive music. Um, and you can
Yeah,
have good
other
and bad uppercase P progressive music, for instance, Atheist that I mentioned, and then Enslaved being sort of a bad example of that. But I think there is descriptive power there.
all right. Next up,
Next up, Gothic. Uh, this is a tricky one because it is much like Viking, kind of just an aesthetic that you can place over stuff. So you can have sort of the most obvious example being Gothic Doom, but you can have elements of death metal and black metal that obviously lean heavier into the goth aesthetic than some bands. Like a band like Mutilation, they're very firmly in the black metal territory, but I would say there's a kind of weighty
and the
drab
Toolist.
gothness.
Look at the Toolist cover of
Well, yeah,
Pure Black
Tool's,
Energy.
yeah, or like Gehenna and bands like that, where they lean into. I'm really hesitating to use the C word here, but they really lean into the sort of goth elements far more than say an Immortal or something like that. So I would say it would belong on here, but I'd maybe put it, I don't know, towards heavy, because gothic metal in its purest form does borrow heavily from heavy metal. I'm thinking bands like Paradise Lost and My Dying Bride. In fact, but they're also closer to death metal. Uh, maybe sort of, yeah, maybe around there. Not really much thrash in there. Any thoughts, or does this one belong in the bin?
I'm not learned enough on Gothic metal. I think about that band, that German band with the female singer. Uh, I forget their name, but uh, it was also operatic.
Is it Epica?
Not Epica. It was Theater of Tragedy.
Oh, Fear of Tragedy. Yeah.
I would consider them Gothic. Would you?
Uh, yeah, sort of early operatic, but yeah, definitely Gothic, symphonic. There's kind of a lot of crossover there. I mean, it's most of it's garbage, but yeah.
Yes, most of it is garbage. I mean, the closest that really like most things that are called gothic, if they're like just not kind of like mood, is like maybe they borrow from like gothic rock, like technique wise, but really it's very akin to something like Viking metal in that it's just kind of a description of a certain aesthetic atmosphere that can be, as Shelley said, attached to just about any genre.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
like a
I think
band
it
like
should go
Typo.
rubbish. I think it should go in the rubbish bin.
Okay, yeah, I think a band like Typo Negative probably come closest, but they're more
They're
arguably a
hard
hard
rock.
rock band than they
Yeah.
are, yeah, than they are a metal band. But there's elements of maybe Doom in them. But yeah, anyway, okay, moving on. Glam hair metal. I think
Oh
this
hell
might
yeah!
Don't they?
actually belong.
Do you think it
I,
qualifies?
I think it might
Uh,
qualify.
it parts of it are pretty close to traditional heavy metal, especially in the very earliest days of glam metal before it became full on pop music.
Yeah, like before it's stadium
I, I
rock, like
I think of like
era.
Wasp and bands like that.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's very clearly a heavy metal, as Tyler said, in their early stages. There's a very clear heavy metal element to them, and I think the glam thing, as derided as it was, it did have an influence over like the theatricality of later extreme metal. But it didn't really add anything to the vocabulary of heavy metal in any serious way. But it definitely spoke the language for a period. So I think it does belong here.
All right, I think we have a consensus there. What's up next, Shelley?
War metal.
Ugh.
Uh,
Er,
Can, can we just throw that in the rubbish bin?
again, this does the purpose of this exercise is not necessarily to say whether genres are bad or not. It's to say whether they have descriptive power, and I think war metal does because you instantly know what I'm referring to. But it is basically a form of black metal grindcore. Uh,
that's true. I
Not
do
be
know
like.
immediately what you're referring to. It's boring. I immediately know it's going to be boring.
Well, the thing is, like, Beherit slumped in with war metal. If you look, bring up like a war metal list, Beherit is often in there, and I don't think Beherit is war metal at all. I mean, he did have the song "Nuclear Girl," but that's just Marco being Marco. Um,
well, I think that's probably because of the influence. So there's obvious crossover between a band like Blasphemy and Beherit, but Beherit were far more sophisticated than a lot of that music, but it is, especially Oath of Black Blood, is very influential over most war metal bands in terms of just the utter chaos of it. But I think it does serve a descriptive power, even if war metal is mostly boring.
yeah, there's a disconnect in a lot of war metal that, like, I like when we talk about Samath, and we've spoken a lot about Samath on this podcast. Tyler being a huge fan of Samath, and like I would consider Godless Arrogance that would fit within the war metal schema, but there's so much more going on in it. Like there's you know this sheer terror of black metal. Then you also have a lot of the harshness of death metal incorporated in it too, and it just creates this great aesthetic. And like not many bands can do it that well. Hardly any at all, actually. But
Mm.
when it
I mean,
comes
that's
to like
what war
war
metal is
metal,
aiming for. They want that sheer terror of black metal with like the harshness and like grinding chromaticism of death metal. It's just a lot of the bands in the attempt to do that focus entirely too much on aesthetic and essentially create something akin to three chord droning punk rock.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a disconnect. So war metal could be a thing if it's in the right hands at the right point in time too, because Same as like the last album I would consider it death metal more than black metal, and yeah, it's a messy territory.
Yeah,
With placing war metal, but yeah, we can keep it here. I think it's a good descriptor for a lot of bands that kind of have themes of war or just really like bestial types of expression of black and death metal, if you want to use that term. But
yeah.
yeah, we can keep it here. What's up next?
I like that it's the only one you put in quotation marks as well. Um,
I don't think it's
avant-garde,
real. I'm sorry.
avant-garde metal. Again, this one is not really. It is a useful descriptor, but it's not really loyal to any particular genre. Avant-garde is much like progressive. It's a descriptor that you put in front of something. So everything from gore guts to elements of Celtic frost can be avant-garde, voivod, like anything that is disruptive, challenging and artistic in a disruptive way. And it can
Rubbish
be
bin.
absolutely awful. Well, it can be absolutely awful when it's bad, but an album like Obscura is technically an avant-garde death metal album, and it's one of the best death metal albums ever recorded. So,
Yeah, I think the problem with avant-garde as a descriptor is that it's almost a negative descriptor in a way. And that sounds weird, but really what it becomes defined by is that a standardized format becomes established for a genre, and then avant-garde becomes defined by not sounding like the standardized format, which means it's still in a sense defined by that. And because of that, it's like really all I know when I'm going to listen to something that's described as avant-garde for the most part, other than outliers like Obscura, is that it's going to utilize aesthetic elements that aren't commonly used in various subgenres or genres of music.
yeah, you'll get odd instrumentation, maybe some very odd chord shapes, and maybe vocal styles that aren't typical. Again, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about a band like Necromantia that uses saxophone in what is basically occult black metal. And again, it works for them. They're one of the exceptions that prove the rule. But I think the common theme of avant-garde that works is that it is very conversant in the tradition of the genre, and is therefore able to add new ideas and suggestions to it, rather than completely ripping up the rule book and just being this kind of unanchored, contextless mess of sort of wacky material. I think that's kind of the key to understanding what makes good avant-garde versus just stuff that thinks it's being disruptive for its own sake.
Rubbish bin.
Trash.
Okay, all right, fine. Post metal.
Trash
Rubbish
can.
This
bin.
much like progressive, it's deeply unhelpful because post metal, very very unhelpful kind of descriptor. But it is referring to a very specific form of very very sparse, very very empty music that relies heavily on atmosphere, heavily on emotion, and not much else. And it's not, metal is after metal. It is a very specific form of metal, and obviously it's borrowing from post rock bands like Mogwai and Godspeed You Black Emperor and things. But yeah, as far as this schema, it does not work. Um, it does not fit, and it's not really a genre of metal. Whenever I get sent a post metal album, it normally goes in the trash anyway.
Slow emo music with
Concur.
harsh vocals
Next
is
up.
not metal. Put it in the trash.
What's up next?
Cool. Groove metal.
Pantera.
Trash
Well,
can.
yeah, we obviously immediately reach for Pantera and maybe like later Sepultura, but it's really just a form of thrash. Um, but it kind of just describes the fact that they're not playing like traditional sort of D beat based thrash. They've slowed it down and put a bit of groove on it. But I don't think groove counts as its own genre, because groove is literally just a description for a specific technique within music.
It's
All right,
useful
rubbish
What's
in
bin.
letting me know what not to listen to.
What's
so
up next?
next up is sludge metal,
That's what
archetypical.
Godflesh turned into.
Kind of what Godflesh turned into. Neurosis, obviously the big name in sludge, basically just slow hardcore. maybe with some doom elements if you're lucky, but it's very dull music as far as I'm concerned.
Rubbish bin.
Trash can.
Okay, we're getting through them now. Stoner, I've already made my thoughts
Rubbish
clear on
bin.
that.
Trash
I'm not
can.
going to put it in the rubbish bin. I'm going to put it near heavy.
You think it's
Because I
real?
think,
Stoner metal isn't real.
well,
It's just bad in music form.
I think it's real in the sense that it is the direct ancestor of Black Sabbath. Again, real in this sense of putting
Ancestor.
it on this chart is not me giving the seal of approval to these subgenres. It's me saying whether they have descriptive power or not. And when a band says they're stoner, it does have some descriptive power for me in that I will understand what they sound like. They will sound like Black Sabbath, maybe with a fuzzier guitar tone.
And more hard rock influences.
All right, I'll put it in the bin.
In the bin.
Folk. This is
All right.
exactly the same.
I
The
agree.
exact
It's
same.
rubbish bin. I agree. It's rubbish bin.
Yeah,
But I
me too.
looked up folk metal, and
Well, you're right about
summoning falls within the genre of folk metal.
Who?
Summoning.
Summoning. Summoning
Yeah, I
never
looked
get
at a
described as
list
folk
of.
metal.
I looked up a list of folk metal bands, and summoning was in there.
I've never heard summoning described as folk metal before, even though there are
I haven't
obviously
either.
All
there's
right,
obvious folk elements
rubbish
to them,
bin.
but yeah.
I
I
can
saw
see
a
the
list of
logic.
folk metal bands, and summoning was in it. That's all I want to say on that. So yeah, it's a descriptor. It's not a real thing. Okay, rubbish bin.
Well, yeah, I was going to say it's basically follows the same structure as Viking metal in that you can apply folk elements to any form of metal, but it is not its own genre. It doesn't kind of change the language of the four genres we've got here when it's added. It's just an extra dimension that they can place on top of it.
Yeah, a
All
lot
right,
of
next
folk
up.
metal was interesting.
Okay, operatic symphonic. So we kind of touched on this with the Gothic stuff, but
Rubbish
symphonic is
bin.
symphonic is an
Trash
interesting
can.
one because obviously it's a prefix for black metal as well. Like you get symphonic black metal. Operatic is literally just metal, heavy metal with operatic style vocals, maybe with some poppier elements in. Pure symphonic metal. Well, I mentioned Epica earlier, but again, that's kind of a bit like Therion, later Therion, in that it borrows the furniture of classical and places it in a sort of pop heavy metal kind of context. Um, I'd say it's close to heavy metal, maybe with some black metal elements. Or
I'd
are
say
we
it's
the
pretty
more beers
close
Jason gets
to.
through? Is it just everything going in the bin?
I'd say it's pretty close to the garbage I threw in the can yesterday, personally.
Okay,
Yeah,
into the
sorry,
garbage it
Shelley.
goes. I know I'm not sentimental about the genres. I'm using this as a an exercise in how these terms have any descriptive power or not. I'm not using them as a defense for the genres themselves.
Well,
Um,
Therion, we can say they're like the later Therion. They're more like a heavy metal band that has flavors of operatic and symphonic, right? I mean, essentially they're going for like a heavy metal opera, and a strong emphasis on the heavy metal. So, um, yeah, I think the descriptor. So many people say it's like this is symphonic black metal, and it's like okay, but symphonic metal as a whole, it doesn't exist. It's just a descriptor. It's not like Viking metal and all that. So I would say rubbish bin.
yeah, when you say descriptor, just to clarify, it's not saying anything about the substance of the music itself. It's saying something about the way it's presented, i.e., the timbres used, the maybe some of the techniques, but as Tyler mentioned as well, it often describes the stuff around the music, like how the band dress, what style their album artwork is in, what lyrics they will sing about, but they're not describing the substance of the music itself, how it's composed, how it was put together, like how it's structured, that kind of thing. And I think that's why I'm so convinced more than ever now after this exercise that these four are the only four genres of metal that you can really say have that. There's literal stuff that you can point to in the music that defines what they are. And there's these other things on here that you can map onto them, and they are useful descriptors and little ways to be more specific. But people have got so carried away with that that they've kind of forgotten to talk about the music itself. They're talking about presentation more than anything.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Shelley, and I think you did a great job in getting these axes here as like this is metal if it falls within these quadrants, and I completely agree with this, Shelley. So I think a great exercise will be placing some bands within these quadrants. We placed some subgenres there and threw most of them into the rubbish bin, but let's actually put some bands here, and so we'll return and do that for you. All right, let's go on a 5 minute break.
Oh, okay.
Take your piss.
All righty. Um, yeah, sorry I got on the joke train there with throwing things into the trash can. I mean, that does like somewhat adequately describe how I feel, but um, at the same time, it was also kind of
No, don't worry. I think Jason's putting the beers away, but I was like, yeah, as I said, it's not me kind of trying to legitimize or vindicate the genres themselves. It's more just are they are they describing something in the context of metal more generally? And yeah, I totally agree with something like Gent or Viking. I'm still not so sure about some of the stuff we've thrown in the trash, but
yeah, like folk
yeah, it's
metal for
more.
me really goes in there with Viking because there's a lot of folk metal that's like practically indistinguishable from Viking metal. Um, it's like, oh, well, folk metal is different from Viking metal because they use folk instruments. Like, there's a ton of Viking metal that uses folk instruments to try to put across that medieval Viking era Scandinavian feel. I don't really see the difference a lot of the times. Maybe folk metal can lean towards being more poppy, sound like flogging Molly with harsh vocals or something. But, um, but yeah,
Well, yeah,
it,
I
it
think folk is a much broader term because you'd have bands like Primordial or whatever. It's more just anything that has a regional folk element to it, whereas Viking is specific, obviously, to Scandinavia, basically. Not that you have to be Scandinavian to play it, but the vibe has to be
yeah,
specifically about that.
I see your point there. It's just like when you're talking about regional like variants, though, I get what folk metal is going for, but it feels so artificed. Like there's regional variants that I consider organic within, uh, well, I guess what you would call like heavy metal proper. Like even with like death metal and black metal, where you can very clearly say that's a Swedish sound or that's a Finnish sound. And I get folk metal like, yeah, but we're going for like the traditional music of our countries, you know, um, or our people or whatever. But yeah, it just feels so artificial that it starts to feel like and like many of these other descriptor forms of subgenres, where really what you're being told is like, for lack of a better way to put it, like what flavor of soda are you buying?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I think again that is one of the reasons why I tend to get annoyed. I use festival lineups as the obvious example of this, but just the guilty by association thing where you're told that you should like XY band because of very, very surface level things. And I'm not saying that everyone, even like mildly interested in metal, should be as conversant in it as we are. But there is an annoyance of someone saying, oh, well, you like loud distorted guitars and aggressive vocals or whatever, you must like slam. It's like,
Yeah.
that is a wildly different prospect to the kind of music that I like. And I think we uncovered some of that in our metal adjacent episode as well, in talking about these albums that are not remotely like aesthetically similar to metal, but they have a lot of the same kind of substance, and what they're trying to get across, the heaviness of it is very similar in a lot of ways. And I think that really, it's almost like the gatekeeping litmus test in a lot of ways. That really sorts the people that are genuinely into the spirit or the underlying like energy of heavy metal, and people that just like the, as you sort of say, as like the soda.
Yeah, exactly. They just want a certain flavor, whatever the flavor of the week happens to be, or whatever. Um, and yeah, that gaslighting gets really annoying. I get tired of basically being told that there's something wrong with me uh, to say that I like heavy metal and not like this band simply because they have harsh vocals and distorted guitars. Oh, it's practically the same thing. It's like, is it really the same thing? You're not allowing me to have this conversation with you because you're browbeating me by just insulting my personality, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and it's like, I'm not just here to tell you that's bad and you shouldn't listen to it. So that's like a frequent criticism of gatekeepers, quote unquote, like myself. It's like, no, I'm not trying to curate your taste. Uh, but I am willing to talk with you about how I feel about this music and what I feel are its qualities. Uh, if you're willing to have that conversation, then you're clearly not. The only answer you want to hear is either I'm an asshole or that what you like is good.
Well, yeah, it speaks to a very deep insecurity that people have about their taste in music if they need vindication from other people or to believe that they're arseholes if they don't think it's good. It's like, yeah, a lot of people think music I like is shit, but I have enough conviction and understanding of why I like that music that it doesn't matter to me. Whereas a lot of people seem to want the approval of other people for that.
Yeah,
Yep, you don't
absolutely.
go to external factors for your validation. You look within. All right, let's rank some bands. Not rank, but let's align some
Align
bands.
them. So,
Yeah,
first up, we got a band called Morbid Angel. Have you heard of these guys?
I would say
I think I have heard of
in
them. I
between
heard they're
death and
pretty good.
thrash. Yeah, Morbid Angle is pretty good. In between death and thrash, probably on the extreme spectrum of both, like bottom left hand corner, like even
Okay.
further. Yeah, let's just move it all the way to the left, and like all the way past the alignment. Like they're their own thing. Like even further to the left, like
I'm not
further,
going any
much
further. I'm not going further.
Keep moving
further.
right until they're in the rubbish bin. Just keep moving in that direction. Well, we don't agree on that.
Mayhem.
Mayhem, I would
I
say yeah, death and or black and thrash. Yeah, I would
well,
say that's accurate.
because Death Crush is kind of well, it's not funcore. It is like a grinding, thrashy, early black metal EP. But again, I guess Mayhem have had a long enough career that they're a little bit harder to place. But I'd say there was an underlying thrash element to them, even in their sort of black metal peak.
Beherit, heavy and black.
No thrash. I would say they have more thrash than Mayhem.
I
I
think
mean,
they
they
have
do have
some
that
heavy metal
grindcore
influences.
influence.
Okay, this one's gonna be hard to place. I do hear some straight up heavy metal aspects to Beherit. All right. What do you think, Shelley?
I'll just move them both up there because I hear obvious sort of proto thrash elements in their early material. Especially as Tyler mentioned, sort of fire, grindcore. Uh, I don't hear the heavy metal unless we're
The
talking
Gate of
about
Nanna. The Gate of Nanna is heavy metal.
uh, yeah, I guess it is. Yeah, that's a good point. What do you think, Tyler?
I feel like the Gated Nana is just like a kind of example of um, electronic music influence on Beherit. It's got like some similar like rhythmic approaches to some of the kind of electronic music from the time. But I see what Jason is getting at. Um, but I honestly feel like you're looking at like archetypal Beherit, you're getting like a black metal approach to atmosphere and melody with some grindcore approach and riffing. So I would almost, I feel like where they're at is pretty good. But
Okay.
I hear a little bit of heavy in the Beherit, but yeah, I guess the spectrum here being that it's closer to thrash, but still incorporates some heavy accurate.
Okay, so next up is Cradle of Filth. I'm going to place them.
Well, they're
I know.
basically Iron Maiden creepypasta, so let's move it where we put fucking power
Why do
metal.
we keep making ourselves talk about this band?
I put it there
Further
just
away
to
from
fucking
black
make
metal.
you depressed. It's just
Remember
to make you
when Vinny
depressed, Shelly.
Filth sent you a video, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't wearing pants in the video.
He was wearing
Just gonna
pants.
put the. He was. It didn't. It looked like he was pantsless. Um, and I was wondering
Well,
why
his
he did
soul was
that.
crushed. His soul was crushed.
Yeah, could you
Oh my god! Sorry, I've just pulled it
shout
up.
out
You're
to my
right.
friend? He hates your band.
Yeah, I just pulled it up on my phone. He's not wearing trousers, as we say in the UK.
I knew it.
I think they're fine where they are. Elements of black metal, elements of heavy metal. Yeah, they have the occasional thrash riff, but yeah, I think that's where they belong.
Sorry to rain on your
Incantation.
parade show. Oh, between. Ooh, that's. So Doom Metal was kind of.
It's
Yeah,
not an
it's going to
axis.
be more closer to death. But I would say it's closer to. Yeah, thrash too. There's thrash elements. Shit, this is a hard one to place.
I mean, for me, and you always say like Onwards to Golgotha is like the best and purest statement of death metal that doesn't sort of borrow from other forms of music. But I think we do have to acknowledge the heavy metal DNA via the doomier aspects. But you're right, they
Yeah,
are also
yeah, I would
kind of
put it
embedded in
closer to
thrash as
heavy
well.
than thrash, but there are thrash elements.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's good where it's at.
Tyler,
How
any
about you,
thoughts?
Tyler?
No, I'm totally all right with that. Yeah, you get some heavy metal elements because I mean a lot of their doominess, as the band outright said, is from Autopsy, and Autopsy was clearly like aping some Black Sabbathisms in their doominess. So I think that's a good position for them.
Cool. Next up, Profanatica. Uh, I would say
Oh,
closer to thrash than Beherit even, but definitely black metal.
I
Maybe a
think
little
they
bit
need to
back
be
towards
moved to
the
the
death
left.
metal. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
death
agree.
metal.
Yep. Like they've got black metal elements, but they also have, I mean, some Profanatica songs are pretty close to incantation songs sometimes.
Well,
So,
they're really
Yeah,
close
that's
to
fair enough.
Necrovore. Really close to Necrovore, and I think Necrovore is closer on the death than black. Yeah, I would move it further to the left. Pretty close to the line there. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's good.
Okay.
All right, so
Next up.
all you guys making fun of us because we always talk about crap Fanatica. We talked about them again, so there you go.
I like
We
Profanatica.
do like
Screw you.
them. I said a commenter is like, you guys always talk about crap Fanatica. We like Pro Fanatica. We're sorry that we like Pro Fanatica. We like men who
Yeah,
dress up as nuns and
I,
play
I'm
bombastic
I'm not sorry.
black metal.
I'm not so, yeah, I'm not sorry. Like better music, all of you commenters.
Um,
And
Next up
I
is
hear to this day they
Nocturnus.
still dress up as nuns.
Yep.
Yep.
Next up is
Mother
Nocturnus.
Teresa Paul Ledney.
Um, yeah, I would say for Nocturnus,
I
pretty
would put
close
closer to
between death and
thrash and death.
thrash.
Closer
Yep.
to thrash and death. Yeah.
How am I doing this that way? Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Demon
Do
Burger.
you want
Demon
do you want to add
Burger.
any bands, Tyler and Shelley, while we're doing this?
No, I
Sorry.
like this list.
I just put random bands here, like Dimmu Borgir. What the fuck?
Well, I would definitely.
Black
There's no
and
rubbish
kind of in
bin.
the
We have to
similar
place them.
range to Cradle of Filth.
Yeah, there's no rubbish bin. We have to place them.
No,
I
I
think,
would
yeah,
say just because of their first two albums, they're definitely closer to black metal than Cradle of Filth, but
Isn't For
still
All
huge
Teed
heavy
an
metal.
EP? Isn't For All Teed an EP?
no, I
No,
think
no,
it's a
it's an
full
album.
length.
Oh, it is? Oh, I saw it
Yeah.
was an
Yeah.
EP. All right.
But I would say they're a
First
little
two
more black
albums.
metal than Cradle of Filth, but still a lot of heavy metal.
Well, early Dimmu Borgir I would put further to the black metal spectrum, but what they became, um, yeah, was completely removed from black metal, like the black metal ethos and all that. So next up,
Next up, Obituary.
heavy more than thrash. Really, you're putting it closer to thrash.
It's
Okay, we're
definitely got a
Again,
lot of thrash in it. Have you ever listened to Slowly We Rot?
I
yeah,
have.
I was thinking of Slowly We Rot. I'll put it closer to heavy, I guess.
Yeah, there's some heavy metal elements to Obituary. Especially the
Mm,
song "Slowly We Rot." I mean, it starts out with like a heavy metal type of riff. Yeah, let's just keep it there. That's fine.
oh, this next one's going to be hard to place. Carcass. Because if we're taking their career in
Grindcore.
totality, well,
Yeah.
that's the thing. If we're taking their career in totality,
It's going to be
we
way up
have to swap.
towards, yeah, it's going to be
Heavy,
like
yeah.
heavy and thrash. So, like their early days, you could
Yeah.
put them closer to death
Yeah,
metal,
hardly
but
any death metal. Let's move it closer to the line, like the heavy line. Yeah, yeah, not really that much death metal.
Uh,
Sorry, Craig Zoller. No, no, further right, further right.
yeah, but I just realised that's putting it closer to blackmail. No, that'll do. That'll do. You happy with that, Tyler?
yeah, I'm all right with that.
Cool. Again, uh,
This is
Immortal.
much more fun if you're drinking beer.
They go up
Sorry,
in
I
the
bring the
they
pizza.
go up in the crap black metal zone with Cradle of Filth and Doom and Borgir. If you're considering their later career, much more towards black, obviously. If it's like the first, 3 or 4 albums, but
Well, they'd need to go near thrash then if we're talking
Yeah,
like Sons of Northern Darkness era. But
but the thing
yeah,
too is like they did have a death metal album, Blizzard Beast.
that one's really good.
So it's one of my favorites.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would move them a little bit to the left, even to there. Um, yeah, that's good. We'll keep them there. They do have a lot of death metal elements in there. What's up next? Celtic
Celtic
Frost.
Frost.
Celtic Frost.
Ooh,
Oh, Celtic Frost. Sorry.
This will be hard to place actually because
heavy or thrash?
well, heavy thrash. Are we calling them black as well, even though they kind of predate the
I
label?
would say a little to the
They
right of
said they were death
thrash.
metal in an early interview.
More,
Sorry,
yeah,
Tyler, could you repeat that?
a little, maybe a little to the right of thrash, kind of up towards the heavy, but maybe not past the middle axis, but not too much far towards black. So they've got death metal elements too. I mean, they influence both significantly. So
Someone
Yeah, I
like
would put them closer to black. Because we remember the conversation where we had where we say they reach for things that are beyond their scope, and that's more of a black metal thing than a death metal thing. Like black metal musicians or death metal musicians are really proficient at their instruments. They can play a million notes a minute, and Celtic Frost kind of strips it all back, and they go for the mood, the more Dionysian type of expression than the Apollo. So I would put closer to black.
yeah, I mean, if you
mm,
listen to Morbid Tales and A Blaze in the Northern Sky back to back, you can definitely hear some similarities in approach, I think. So
oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think I'm happy with where they are. Closer to death metal than Immortal because Celtic Frost, as you mentioned, Tyler, they're very influential on early death metal, almost as much as black metal. And because they are of the 80s, there's just going to be a huge thrash influence in there as well, almost by osmosis. Uh, Speaking of thrash, next up is Slayer. So I'm just going to the
uh,
thrashiest of the thrash bands, but
yeah, they're
maybe
definitely
with
very much towards thrash. They've got to be a little bit towards death metal, though. I know Jason might disagree with me, but I feel like however you feel about the quality of the band, they clearly had an influence on death metal. Like Incantation said that Hell Awaits was one of their biggest influences, and they covered Hell Awaits. So
South of Heaven, which is an album that a lot of people say is good quality, um, is not death metal. There's no death metal DNA in South of Heaven, but Rain and Blood and Hollow Weights, I would say, yeah. It should be aligned a little bit more to Death and Black. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
complete thrash band.
if we're talking a band like Possessed or whatever, if you listen to Possessed, Seven Churches, and Hello Eights back to back, you kind of do get the foundational material for a lot of death metal. Absolutely, but yeah, I mean, I would agree. South of Heaven,
I,
they were trying something a bit different. So if we take their albums in totality, but yeah, I think I'm happy with where they are.
Same.
Okay, speaking of war metal, Blasphemy. I'm going to place them more towards thrash and definitely on the black side.
Yeah, solid to me.
I'm okay with that.
Already controversial. Metallica. Fucking hell.
Metallica's
Just in the
thrash
middle
as
thrash.
hell, but they got a lot of heavy metal too. In fact, like the first Metallica album is pretty much real fast NWOBHM. So
And they
Yeah.
stole a lot from heavy metal bands too. Yeah, I wouldn't place them
Uh,
anywhere near death metal though. I would place them right in the center, neither
yeah,
death
put them
nor
on the center
black.
line. Yeah, they don't really
so
have any
then,
of that stuff.
yeah. Okay. Liturgy is
Liturgy.
next.
We don't
There's
have
no
a
rubber
trash
spin.
can.
You
Where
have
are
to
we
place
supposed
it.
to put this?
There's no rubber spin.
I just realized we got Liturgy next, and next up we get to rank Immortal again. Um,
Change Immortal to something else. Change Immortal to Emperor. Sorry.
right. Let me think about that. Liturgy. You obviously the temptation will be to say, well, it's black metal, but that's kind of just in the descriptive sense of the word. They are most obviously taking influence from black metal, but they don't. Like I was sort of saying to Tyler while you were on your break, Jason. Like they don't really use the language of genre in a way that appeals to me. They're more of just a kind of sound art band that happen to use some elements from a genre that I like. So I don't really think they're
Upper
aimed at
right
me.
hand quadrant, but way outside of it, like above where it says bands. Um,
I mean, that kind of looks like we're almost praising them for being so out there, but
No,
tell you what
Morbid
I'll do.
Angel didn't even get that fucking treatment. Come on.
Yeah.
Morbid Angel should be like way skewed to the left, to like the best of death metal ever.
there's not much room, Jason.
Hang on. Give me a second. Uh, oops.
Ribbish.
Ribbit. So
Gonna be
Shelley's
just for
making rubbish
liturgy.
pen.
There we go.
Yeah.
Cool.
What are you gonna do with
I'll just move that to one side.
There you go.
Actually, that is appropriate. We could put like Immortal later down in as like melodic thrash.
Yeah.
Stadium Vulcan rock music, pretty much.
Why is this happening?
Yeah. At the heart of winter is pretty much painkiller with harsh vocals.
Yeah, I don't recognize that album as Immortal. That's when Abbott started writing shit.
Yeah,
Yep.
I quite like At the Heart of Winter, but after that it's sort of just kind of just beefed up thrash with vestiges of what Immortal were.
All right.
Burzum.
Black.
I
A
mean,
little
obviously
bit of
black,
Absolutely.
thrash.
but
Yeah, I would say a little bit of thrash.
A little
especially
bit
in the
of
earlier
thrash,
stuff.
Yeah.
but very black. More black than Demon Burger. Come on, man.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Like Burzum's about as black
Sorry,
as it
Cradle of
gets.
Filth first. Uh, yeah, you're right. Sorry, it's not even as far as with Mayhem. Yeah, so I just forgot Cradle of Filth started out as a death metal band, so I just moved them slightly over as well. Dismember.
death and
More on
heavy.
the heavy side.
Yeah.
Definitely heavy, more heavy influences than incantation. But there is a thrash element to it because, obviously they're the archetype of like Swedish death metal that borrows a lot from D beat, but to some extent. Well, actually, no, it's more like new wave of British heavy metal with D beats. So maybe it belongs there.
All right. You guys don't want to rank any more bands? It's good?
I think this is good.
I think we
we
proved
did
that
it.
point.
Or aligned bands?
Although you didn't really put any heavy metal bands in here, but I guess it's just
I don't listen to Piece of Thrash. Well, what about Black Sabbath? That'd be heavy.
I got
That'd be straight heavy.
uh,
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I don't think Black Sabbath are even a heavy metal band. I think they are a heavy rock band that had a lot of heavy metal riffs, or what would later be understood to be heavy metal riffs.
yeah. I roughly agree with you, but their influence on all of heavy metal is huge. Even when you're listening to like the rawest demo period of like underground death metal at its peak, you will hear Black Sabbath riffs. Um, in like the
Yeah,
doom
I'm not trying to
chorus and
downplay
stuff.
their influence, but yeah, I'm not trying to downplay their influence. I fully acknowledge that they are as influential as people say, but because heavy metal didn't really exist when they were writing and they didn't know what they were grasping for, I think it was really formalized with bands like Judas Priest and later obviously Iron Maiden. But
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah, I think those would go very much in the heavy category.
All right, guys.
Where would you place Voivod? More thrash. That'll be thrash, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, thrash maybe with some heavy metal in there as well. But again, if we're looking at their career in totality, it'd be much harder because they kind of went hard rock for a bit. But yeah. All right,
All right.
so yeah, I think we've sort of stress tested my little theory here that there are only four genres of metal, and anyone that tries to tell you otherwise either doesn't understand metal or is being disingenuous. Um, the other elements that we've talked about, the subgenres and so on, that's not to say that they don't have descriptive power when you're trying to be more specific, because obviously thrash, black death, and heavy metal are hugely broad as far as like the amount of music that they cover. Um, but be very careful when you're using these descriptors as to whether you are describing an aesthetic, lyrical themes, costumes, or different instruments that are involved, or are you actually describing compositional techniques, structures, and the music theory behind it? I think that's what I'm trying to get across here. Obviously, if you're a casual fan, then well, you're probably not listening, but not necessarily be so worried about that kind of stuff. But if you consider yourself seriously into this music, really interrogate what the descriptors are actually, what purpose they're serving. I think that's all I'm trying to get across here. So, any final thoughts from you guys?
That was a fun little exercise. I understand this may not be as fun as the tier list where everyone gets to chime in about where they would place things. This is more about like the nitty gritty, the essence of the music. Um, and I think this is a good exercise to kind of understand what metal actually is and where different things fall within it. Like you said, a lot of things are descriptive in metal nowadays, and I think that's the laziness of metal journalists and all of that, where it's like, oh, this is pirate metal because they have a parrot and things like that, where they look at the quirky aspects of these bands. Like we were talking about the Decibel article about the skateboarders and being the only really substantive thing to talk about that band is that they skateboard. That's not talking about the music itself. You should definitely try to, when you're listening to extreme metal, especially and even heavy metal, thrash metal, and any offshoots and hybrids, kind of try to think where they actually fall within the schema of metal itself. This is one example of a schema. It may not be definitive. Like I do think there's a lot of overlap with punk music, even though punk isn't metal, like hardcore and all that. A lot of people say it's metal. I personally don't think it's metal, but like we said earlier, there are a lot of nice hairy armpit ladies that come from that scene, and we should treat them as equals. So there's that. And yeah, I think it was a good exercise today. How about you, Tyler?
Honestly, it was a nice change of pace from the tier lists, and we got to talk about some of the more in-depth aspects of the music. So I think that it was a really good way to illustrate a point about what makes music what it is.
Yep,
Awesome.
as this schema has, is it all requires intra musical activities, as in the riffs, the overarching song structure. It's all musical activity, and all metal shares that. If it doesn't have that, or it focuses too much on percussion or um, rhythmic aspects, then it kind of starts faltering from being metal. Not necessarily metal like Tool. There's a lot of rhythmic aspects to Tool, but they're not a metal band, even though they have distorted guitars and they have quote unquote profound, the alien people, the weirdos out there call them profound lyrics and textual components. But they're essentially a hard rock band that's avant-garde, and they're not really metal because they're more focused on the percussive and rhythmic side. So when you listen to metal, try to really ask yourself the question: is it really metal or not? And I think that will shed a lot of insight in uh, you personally, as well as what you convey to others. There's so many people say that Tool is metal, and that's a great miscarriage of what metal actually is. So that's my 2 cents on that. Thank you, Shelly, for being the driver today. I know I had some technical issues, and I appreciate everything you did today.
That's all right, no worries. I will forever be referring to Tool fans as alien people now.